Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last session in a very long day. We're about 10 minutes behind our schedule, but actually considering the wealth of information we've been hearing today, well, that's not too bad. So as I mentioned earlier, this last panel, as in most of our programs, we usually reserve the last panel for what we like to think of as a round table, where we engage more directly with our fellows to talk about issues of coverage and bring in some of the experts who can help them out with suggestions and maybe engage in a direct dialogue. So I'm going to expect all of you to be much more engaged, and I'm going to welcome questions and comments actually about experiences you've had in covering not just solitary but corrections issues in general. So we can engage in some sort of dialogue, considering that it is a virtual session, not a real live session. We plan to go till about 5:30 or 5:45 or so, but if you must leave, I won't be insulted. Go ahead and leave early, but if you can stay, we should be going till about 5:45 at Eastern time. So first, let me introduce the fantastic folks we have to take us through this last session. And they've been chosen particularly because of their specific experiences. The first one I want to introduce is Jeremiah Bourgeois, who I'm really proud and honored to have with us. He, for the longest time, he was our columnist at the Crime Report while he was inside prison in Washington State, where he was spending a life without parole sentence, and educated himself and worked. He's been in solitary, and he's now a incipient lawyer. I don't know if he's got his bar exam yet, but he can tell us about that. Also with us is Vincent Schiraldi, who many of you may know. If there's anyone who represents the new wave of thinking about justice issues inside corrections and outside community supervision, it's Vinny. He is the founder and the director of the Columbia Justice Lab. We've heard several people today who are researching at the Columbia University Justice Lab, and earlier in our session as well. We're also honored to have with us Jean Casella, who is the director of Solitary Watch, and obviously by its name, we could not have ignored Jean in a meeting like this. Jean was in our 2018 session as well, and I'm sure she shares with me some of the frustrations we've had when we talked about, hey, things are changing and are about to change. That was 4 years ago, and we've now, in many ways, gone back. So maybe she'll talk about that, and particularly talk about how coverage has changed or how it might change. Just a quick word about Solitary Watch. It was founded in 2009, aiming at increasing public awareness of solitary. And her writing has appeared in outlets all over the country, and she's co-editor of one of the best books, one of the most gripping books on the subject, which is called Hell is a Very Small Place, which is an anthology of voices of people who've been in solitary confinement. And I should add that Jeremiah is an author as well. We've anthologized his columns for the Crime Report, and they're on Amazon and available to be purchased for a very, very reasonable price. So if you want to find out about it, it's on our site as well. You can just order it through Amazon. So let me start. What I've asked is each of our speakers to give us up to 10, it doesn't have to be 10, but 10 trends or 10 issues they think that journalists should be thinking about covering or exploring in the areas of solitary confinement and generally corrections issues, if I can add that, for the next year and the years to come, particularly at a time when we're all in a very polarized political climate, as we've been hearing throughout the conference. So, Jeremiah, let me start with you. What are you thinking about how we should be covering and changing our approach to this issue?
I was really interested in the analogy that one of the last panelists made about prison being a city. And things happen in the city, but I think the part that is missed is when people are crammed together, more stuff happens. And this is really the mass incarceration writ large. I do not believe you can operate a correctional facility nowadays with they're understaffed. They got too many people there that shouldn't be. And I think the ultimate result of that is you're going to have problems with safety and security. And the go-to is solitary. And I do want to point out one thing. I've done almost a decade in solitary. I have yet to hear any suggestion that would have kept me in line during my first couple decade in prison outside of solitary. I had numerous assaults on staff. I hit prisoners with weights. I mean, I've come a long way since then. I mean, I even got the solitary confinement reporting project from Gene, thank you. But it's just, I was really wild. I had a cruel and unusual punishment, and I was angry. And I can't see anything outside of throwing me in a cell for a long period of time that would have kept me in line.
So give us maybe 3 or 4 issues that you think we should be looking at, or journalists should be looking at when they're covering this. I mean, you've written a lot about this, but thinking about the next year as to come, what would you think we should, journalists in our audience particularly, should be looking at?
I think they should be looking at the impact of reentry, just the reentry experience of people similarly situated who did not spend a lot of time in solitary, and those that did. I mean, I've had panic attacks in the classroom, in the parking lot of the law school, and to the extent this is just due to being imprisoned in general, who knows? I mean, just trying to disentangle that and get it, just how much solitary played a part in the difficulty that I'm having with reentry. I have to think it does play some type of part, but the extent of which I don't know.
You're on mute, Steve.
That's huge, Jeremiah. Any others that you can think of before we go on to the next, or well, you can think of it. Vinny, I'll go over to you. What are 2 or 3 of the most important stories?
Steve, do you see the question for JJ
The question? No, I don't see it. Yeah, hang on.
in the chat? Someplace.
Oh, I see.
Yes, I see. Well, before we go to the questions, let's just go to a roundup for all the
Sure.
all the speakers.
Right. So,
So, Vinny, you've been seeing, I guess you've heard a lot of the people, you know, a lot of the people who've spoken at the conference. What are you thinking the journalists should be looking at over the next year?
yeah, so I mean, I ran juvenile corrections down in DC and eliminated solitary there. I ran corrections in New York City and almost eliminated solitary there. I think it's I think the screaming match between the advocates and the corrections officers really warrants probing from a media standpoint. They both have some bit of legitimacy to their arguments. The previous panel was right. Rikers wasn't ready to completely eliminate solitary when I got there. It just wasn't. The place was off the hook. There were people, a third of my staff, sometimes more, depending on if it was a long weekend, were out sick, using their unlimited sick leave. There were unstaffed posts, and everybody in an unstaffed post, everybody living in a dormitory where there's no correctional officer, has a shank stuffed under their pillow. Because you'd have a shank stuffed under your pillow if you lived in there. The number of stabbings and slashings had tripled since 2 years earlier, and that's gone up 40% this year. The place is incredibly, stunningly violent. And I'm not saying solitary solves that. I don't think it does. I think it actually exacerbates it in a lot of ways. But when I got rid of it in DC, I took it from the other end. Like what these guys were talking about earlier, we changed the culture. We started to do a variety of things so that people were productively occupied. So they, you know, a bunch of kids, you put my son and a bunch of his buddies in a room all day long, they're going to start climbing the walls, right? So guess what? That's what these kids were doing too in my facility. And so, you know, we productively occupied them all day. We retrained the staff to be more like counselors than like guards. We trained people in de-escalation and using their words instead of just putting their hands on people. We gave staff the ability to put kids on timeouts, but that was for 15 minutes max. You wanted to go beyond that, you had to ask your unit manager. That got you up to an hour. You wanted to go beyond that for 4 hours, you had to ask the warden, you know, the superintendent of the whole facility. You wanted to go beyond 4 hours, you had to ask me, the head of the whole system. Nobody ever asked me. Nobody wants to ask the boss, right? They don't even want to ask the guy for 4 hours. So between kind of making it bureaucratically difficult and really more importantly, changing the culture and changing the experience for the kids, we just kind of entropied our way.
So if I read you right, you're saying that the you know, a priority would be to look at, I guess, the correctional side of the issue. Like what are the staff and administrators saying? But we have, but prisons are the most opaque institutions in our society, probably the most opaque.
Well, I mean,
Almost impossible to get
Yeah.
commentary from guards or from correctional staff.
the good news about New York is that the media coverage has been fantastic here. I mean,
Right.
The number of leaks and people willing to talk about stuff, sneak pictures out, is extraordinary. So actually we're able to cover it. It's just, I don't know, I guess I would suggest to the media, approach it with more of a sense of wonder, because those two sides, they're not wondering. The advocates know the guards are scumbags who hate the inmates, who just want to lock their asses in the stir. And the guards know that the advocates don't give a shit about them, don't care if the incarcerated people are sexually grabbing the women who are correctional officers. 60% of the COs and Rikers are women. They don't care if they're splashing them or throwing feces at them. They don't care if they're punching them in the nose. They don't care if they're held accountable ever. These people on both sides of this, those things I just said, are biblically ensconced in their minds. And the media needs to parcel that out. Doesn't mean the media needs to say, oh, it's okay to put people in 23 hours locked down for 10 years. Of course it's not. But to understand, if you assume the guards are just nothing but scumbags, or if you assume that the inmates are just nothing but scumbags, and I'm using guard and inmate deliberately because of their provocative terms, and that's the way people talk about each other. If that's what you assume, then the story writes itself. Scumbag guard puts guy in a hole, right? Uncaring advocate wants me to get stabbed and splashed with urine. So
We've made a special effort to get the correctional.
So
We made a special effort to get the correctional side of the story in all of our programs. It's always been difficult to get people to come and show up at conferences for whatever reason. We invited Benny Bourgeo Jr., who is the head of COBA, the correction union in New York. He had come, he was willing to come, but he was testifying yesterday, so we couldn't have him in our agenda. But I think that's a key issue, is trying to get correctional guards, get directors, although it's easier to get them. We've had them in our programs, but to get them to speak out and to talk seriously and frankly and candidly about how they see the situation. That's got to be a key priority for people in the media, but it's harder than you can imagine. I'm just wondering, Gene, you've got 10 years of experience covering solitary and these issues. What have you learned that you can tell us about how to do it? You're muted, Gene, so you can.
Yeah, it's been 12 years, actually, amazingly.
Right.
And one thing I want to add to my bio is that 2 of the attendees at this conference are former Solitary Watch interns, and I'm so pleased to see them here. So, in addition to covering this ourselves, we've also kind of closely tracked the other media coverage of the issue of solitary. And we have a feature that we run every week on our website called 7 Days in Solitary, which is highlighting the best reporting and commentary on solitary from the previous week. And one thing I want to say to the journalists here is any change that's happened on this issue, we've heard from all these advocates, many of them amazing. We've heard from experts. A huge driver of change on this issue has been journalism, and I want to acknowledge that. And it continues to be. So it's really important work that you're doing. I'm going to share in the chat an article from 2013 when this was a really very underreported issue. And it's from Columbia Journalism Review, written by my late partner at Solitary Watch, James Ridgway. So I want to talk a little bit about what I think the underreported stories are right now to all of you as journalists. And I agree with what Vinny said, that the coverage of Rikers has been incredibly good. And I would say to people, whether you're a local or national reporter, look at smaller city jails and especially at rural jails. That is the biggest growth population in the jail sector. And, you know, while major city jails under pressure are getting smaller, these other jails are getting bigger, and they are under-resourced, and they're using solitary quite a lot. I would also say, you know, it's time to start moving beyond just documenting the harms that solitary does. I mean, that has to be part of every story, especially, you know, if you're including, as you should, people who with direct experience with solitary. But it's also time to take a more solutions journalism approach to some of this stuff. And I do think that
Explain what you mean by that, if you can, Gene. Not everybody will know that.
I think that you know, the idea behind solutions journalism is that journalists are people who are out there investigating what's going on, and they can also be looking at things that are working and not just things that aren't working. Of course, we have to report on corruption and abuse and all of those things. But, you know, in solitary confinement, for example, we've heard people talk over the last 2 days about certain programs that are working. One of them is the CAPS program on Rikers Island for people with mental health issues that previously would have been put in solitary and now are getting at least some measure of treatment. And if, you know, we need if seriously mentally ill people need to be in jail at all, which is a bigger question, you know, the CAPS program is about probably as good as it gets. There are other, you know, there are efforts out there by, I think Kati just put in the chat something about Bree Williams and the work that she's doing at UCSF in California. She's taking corrections officers to Norway, and then when they come back, working with them to implement some of the more humane practices that they're seeing there. So those are examples of solutions-oriented stories that I think would be a great thing for journalists to be looking at. And the final thing I'll mention is picking up on something that Jeremiah said. What happens to people when they come out of solitary? I mean, if we believe that solitary is torture, and after 12 years of covering it, I have to believe that, you know, everything I've seen tells me that, then we're talking about having hundreds of thousands of torture survivors, some of them in our prisons and some of them in our communities. What do we do with that? That's I think a huge story that hasn't been adequately covered. So I'll stop there.
I agree. Vinny, you got your hand up, so go ahead and take the floor.
Just on the CAPS program, I want to make a point because it might not be obvious as to how the staffing issues affect this issue. So one of them was, as I mentioned earlier, if you're understaffed or staff is working triple and double shifts and they're exhausted, more violence occurs, right? Sometimes by staff towards incarcerated people, sometimes because staff are just out of it and incarcerated people are hurting each other, and that contributes to solitary. But the other side of it is something that Gene talked about. I love the CAPS program. I had nothing to do with establishing it, so I'm going to brag about it all I want. But I couldn't expand it because I didn't have enough staff. It's staff intensive. And before you even get the staff in the room, you got to train the hell out of them because they're working with a bunch of mentally ill people and it's different. And so when you're short-staffed, the kinds of things you want to do that might calm a place down. Like I know several places that were actually pretty decently run jails and everybody's on lockdown and the programs are all canceled and their families aren't coming to visit. So, and they're not getting commissary, and that stuff matters. And so that is like when you're thinking about how to trace a person, a incarcerated person, from being just a regular general population person to a person in solitary who's, you know, committed an act that makes the system think they need that. All that stuff contributes to that. Every little bit of that stuff gets these folks into that situation.
Thanks. Jeremiah, your hand is up.
Yeah, I think one point that really isn't covered, so much of the coverage is focused, as the other panelists said, on the experiences that people have had in there. But there's some people that don't care about the experiences of people confined. What they do care about is how much money they're paying in taxes. There are economic arguments that could be made about the overuse of solitary confinement. I mean, even at my wildest, I didn't need to be there for years. And so it's just the over-reliance on solitary. It's not economical. And as a consequence, that is just one additional driver of the cost of corrections that could be reduced with some changes in policy and perception.
Kathy, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'll go again since I cover, you know, health and criminal justice and have a real passion for the health. I think it's really important for criminal justice, and I put a whole slew of things in the chat that we'll put on the resource page. Everybody is not Jeremiah, right? Health, reentry, whether folks can work, support their families, thrive in community. So much of that is tied to both the physical and the mental, their physical and mental status as they come home. We don't cover that story enough, whether the successes on that front or the very great failures, and how people are living that and what it costs them in their communities. There's Dr. Bree Williams at UCSF. She's a great source. I put it there. Dr. Sarah Vincent in Atlanta, who works with juveniles. She's a psychiatrist. Dr. Michael Champion in Hawaii, who is on the American Psychiatric Association, a panel on criminal justice stuff, and the Council of State Governments. There are all these areas of our coverage because it focuses so much on the obvious, the low-hanging fruit. The health is the higher part of this. And I think journalists need to do more cultivating those stories.
That's a good point. I want to pass the mic over to Shabnam Dinesh, who's got her hand up. So Shabnam, over to you. And you can unmute yourself and put the video on if you'd like.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm wondering about when sending FOIA requests about solitary confinement, about jails. I've tried doing these things and I get rejected all the time. What are some things that people have had success for asking to get some kind of information or data to be able to, you know, kind of just dig into that whole solitary confinement issue?
That's an excellent question. Who wants to, Vinny, maybe you want to handle that?
You know,
You've been on the administrative end, so.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I had like an army of people working on responding to stuff like that. I guess before I answer that, because I really have no idea, because some other people did it and I was there for 7 months, so it's not like I became a FOIA expert. We should be putting this stuff up online. You know, when I was there, we started an effort to just like, what are the 20 things the media asks us about the most? And just started posting them all the time. Like you shouldn't have to do FOIA requests. These aren't my data. They're the people's data. I run a government agency. So I don't really know how to write a FOIA request or how to respond to one. But I think we should hold correction systems to a higher standard and make them put their damn data up online, which DOC's now is.
I mean, Shabnam, are you getting rejected saying we don't have that data? Or are you
Yes.
getting rejected saying they don't want to share it?
Both actually,
Uh-huh,
both. Just a lot of the confidentiality issues, that kind of
right, and
thing.
they'll use HIPAA and things like that. Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question. And the first thing I said in my, underreported stories was cover local jails. And I should have said it's the hardest damn thing you'll ever have to do. I mean, if you think covering prisons is difficult, like, go to these small jails in, Cincinnati or, in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania, and you will have a really hard time getting data. I mean, in some cases, they don't even track who they're putting in solitary confinement. And maybe that becomes part of the story.
That's
And
another thing that
becomes the story.
sorry to cut you off. Yeah, I'll get responses saying like they don't have the information either. That's
Mhm.
another response that I'll get.
Right. And they may not be keeping track of it, appalling as that is.
Shabnam, have you tried investigative reporters and editors just for resources? I know
I'm a member. Yeah.
okay. All right. Okay.
The other tough nut to crack is juvenile solitary. In fact, maybe even tougher than jails. Any ideas, Gene, about how you get to that story?
I think there again, family members have, for advocates, family members have been the entree into, learning the stories of kids in solitary. And I think there are organizations that, like Campaign for Youth Justice, Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, CCLP, which you had a representative on today, was, I thought, terrific. Those people can put you in touch with parents and guardians who are dealing with kids in solitary. But as for the numbers, CCLP has a really rough estimate that's based on, the percentages of people that kids that they've seen spending time in solitary. But we're not going to have anything like the numbers that we have until it becomes legislated that people have to keep these numbers. That's when we'll get the numbers.
On the point of juvenile facilities, I did several years in solitary and juvenile, and it was not called solitary. It wasn't called intensive management unit. Were you to just look at the names of all the units in a juvenile facility, you would never figure out which one houses people under the same conditions as adults in solitary confinement. It's almost like they have a whole sanitized nomenclature for all of it. So you really have to peel back the layers of what's going on in these juvenile institutions to even get an understanding that solitary does exist. It might look a little different, but in the end, it feels the same to that person in that cell.
Chandra,
Also, I just want to ask you, also on the juvenile front, there are a number of philanthropies that are very active. The Casey Foundation, for example, they can also be a resource for programs, especially new initiatives, best practices. So check out some of the big foundations who are doing work on this front.
That's a good suggestion. Thank you, Katie. Chandra Vozelko, over to you with the mic. I see you on there.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Can't see you though, unless you want to give yourself a video spotlight. It's up to you.
I don't know that I have that option from what it looks like.
Oh, well, it depends if you have a camera. Doesn't
No, I
matter.
do. On my thing, it doesn't give me a chance to like toggle on or off. It gave me a prompt to unmute from you.
Oh, yeah, I did that. So well, anyway, go ahead and I'll see if I can put you on.
Okay. First of all, thanks everyone for another great panel and a great fellowship opportunity. I have a question for Jean, which is this. You mentioned solution stories, and I think that instinct is right, that if we could do more of these solution stories, that
Sorry, did we just lose you, or is it just me?
no, I was, as I was
Okay,
getting
great,
onto the camera, everything got delayed. Sorry about that. I think the solutions journalism instinct on your part is correct. I think that if we could show more things that are being done well, then we might be able to spread those practices out. But my concern with doing that is, do we become sometimes an apologist for, I mean, it's like reforming slavery. Like, would we reform slavery or would we abolish it? So I think it's a really tough position that a lot of journalists are in, because when we try to show they're doing this well in this solitary block, it kind of legitimizes that solitary block. And that's a larger question that people have to wrestle with.
But the solutions journalism also contextualizes the problem. I mean, it couches it. Now, I hear you, but I think Jean's point is really well taken for a host of reasons, including news consumership. Like, readers have been worn out on the drone of bad news. And so however we do the solution stuff while saying this is what led to this initiative. I mean, I think there's a way of framing it that doesn't obscure the problems.
Yeah, I think one of the pillars is you have to address the limitations, right? And so there might be a larger limitation, which is that this is in a terrible system anyways, but there's a glimmer of hope here. But I just didn't know if you had any advice for how to walk that fine line, because that, for me especially, is very hard. Because I do see, like, sometimes I see just a feature story in one person who, did a lot of time in solitary, got out and is doing pretty well, especially considering the amount of time they spent in the restricted housing unit. And I don't know what to do, because we don't want to give a false hope, because there are just as many people who are not doing well, and I haven't found their stories yet.
Let me widen the conversation if I can a bit. I wanted to, two people who've asked some really good questions. Clark Merrifield, I don't know if Clark, if you're still there, can I give you allowance to talk, and maybe you have some comments to make? Raise your hand if so, if you're still there. Another person who's been asking really good questions over the course of the 2 days is Salvador Rodriguez. So either one is welcome to join our conversation. If you can hear me, if you're still there, just raise your hand. I'll give you here you go, Salvador. You may not be there any longer, but anyway, let me just make one point that I wanted to ask, your opinion about, because now talking about solitary, talking about correctional issues now is working against a climate that's really hostile in many ways to questions about reform. We're heading into an election period, which is a very polarized period, although some of the panelists and speakers have said that, polls overall show that people separate solitary confinement from other issues of justice, that there's much more compassion and empathy towards people who suffer through solitary confinement than any of the other issues that we talk about in justice. I'm not sure that's right, but I wonder if anyone has a take on exactly how you report into what's a very tough political landscape right now, and whether it's anything about justice issues, but particularly about corrections issues.
I have a suggestion, and I want to respond to Chandra also. Just tell the fucking truth, like what? Tell the truth. I don't think solitary confinement is a two-sided issue, right? Particularly, I think the challenge of how to get rid of it is a challenge, and I have some sympathy for the people that the rest of society has charged to do our dirty work for us and get rid of this problem, that we've allowed to grow to such exponential proportions. I also agree with Jeremiah that, challenging solitary naturally means challenging mass incarceration, because that's why we have so many people in solitary, because you can't control 2.2 million people, without there being problems. But I don't see that we should necessarily be changing the way that we're reporting because it's a more hostile environment, especially on an issue that we've identified as possibly concerning the torture of hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. I don't know, that's my short answer.
Right. It has not come up though in any of the obviously it shouldn't be surprising, that I can see in any particular state or any campaign, any of the congressional campaigns. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen it there. And the question is how you put it on the agenda.
I mean, I heard that
Everything else.
question. I heard that question differently, Steve. So I'll try it a different way because I don't disagree with you, Gene, but New York's got a center-right mayor now because crime went up, right? I mean, he squeaked by a field of more progressive candidates, most progressive candidates, and came right out of the box saying he thinks more people need to be in solitary and he's not going to.
He did.
Yeah, and he's opposing this legislation. He's, you know, when I gave him a tour of the jail and between his election and him becoming mayor, the union guys were flanking him. I couldn't get a word in. They were on his left and on his right telling him this, that, this, that, this, that. So I'm not saying, you know, Gene, I agree. Don't cover it differently. Tell the damn truth. But we have a different audience now. And I think that matters. And I do think people don't think of incarceration and solitary as the same story. I think there are some people that don't want people in solitary, but do want them incarcerated as an example.
I agree.
But it's the, you know, like right now, when I do my stuff on criminal justice, I kind of have an audience of one I care about. Right? And I'm talking to the mayor through the New York Times and the Daily News and my op-eds and whatnot. And that mayor matters, and it's a different mayor.
May I add something about the breadth of our coverage? You know, I got Paco, my cousin, some other people been to prison. So I have my particular sympathies and bent as a human being in community. I think one of the challenges to our journalism is that it isn't well-rounded enough. Sometimes that as we're telling the story about the human rights concerns of over-reliance on solitary, we also need the voices of people like Dean Williams, who said, we're reforming the culture of our prisons so that fewer people even veer in that direction. We don't want to over-rely, yet there is this small population of people that are grave dangers to other people, that we will always need that. I think that's a really important part of the narrative that often as journalists we skip over, and those voices are not going to disappear. And that belief, I hope I'm making a point, because I find, who's that, Jean?
Yeah, I think, you know, I want to go back to the solutions frame, because I think that's part of the challenge of that. And I personally think there may be people who need to be separated in prison, but I've been to European prisons and I've seen that nothing there resembles.
But here it is.
Draconian
I'm sorry.
Practices the way that we treat people in solitary confinement. So I sometimes talk about ending solitary confinement as we know it in the United States. You know,
I hear you, but there's a homogeneity to that, to Norway and all of these other places.
No, half of the people in Norway are actually in prison in Norway are actually immigrants. So that's
okay. Correct. Okay, thank you for that. And so that goes to, okay, that's a whole other thing. But this country has a particular legacy, and the systemic issues that are all a part of this. I just think that for this issue in particular, we still have to cover every side, whatever may be our particular bent. And I don't think that journalists who cover this do a good job of that. And I think for the broad public, for our work to have credibility, especially at a time like this with all these talking heads and shit on 24/7, especially at a time like this, that it lends credence to our coverage when we quote the Dean Williamses of the world, or frankly, the corrections officer who wants to hit somebody over the head who we totally disagree with. But I think it builds out the journalism. I think it's a really important part of the narrative.
Let me bring in Tom McMorrow, who's into the conversation. He's got his hand up. Tom, over to you.
Hello. It's been such a, I don't want to use the word wonderful, because it's certainly gloomy and you know, very sobering 2 days, but it has been wonderful in terms of information and bringing thought to the issue. And it really, it's, you know, we, so many, for example, the issue of mental health. And you know, yesterday we had Pamela Wynn talk about her experience.
Stunning story that she provided.
Yes, and you look at her, and she was someone who's educated, and you know, was a person who, you know, together. I mean, you know, and then you think of someone who's mentally ill and going into solitary, and what's going to come out. I mean, you know, what's going to come out, and to me, it's a systemic issue. It starts with policing, and it goes to the court, and it goes to the county jail, and then it goes to prison. And it's I mean, you know, it's interesting.
So Tom, let me ask you, you are a veteran journalist in Long Island, which is, I would guess,
Suffolk County.
right. So it's not your liberal New York center. So when you're reporting about these things, you're reporting to a different audience than, say, you'd be reporting about in New York. How do you do your coverage accordingly, or how do you look at your sources?
I think you just tell the truth. I mean, you know that.
Well, yes, of course, but what do you
No,
go
but
after?
I'm saying that I don't perceive really a difference. I mean, I'm sure many of the readers of the press or the Star where I worked, or the Independent, you know, are liberal and leftist. Some are very conservative, but it's a big county, and I think that to examine the different cases and try to get it from the, I don't know if this is making sense, to try to get it right from the bottom, the starting point, and then through the process, because I haven't really looked at the county jail enough. We have 2 county jails in Suffolk County, and they're big. They've got sizable populations, and you've got a whole mix of people in the county jail. And I don't think I've spent enough time looking at that, because a lot of the, you know, I see the people, the mental health issues going in. You see them being arraigned in court, and you look at somebody and you know, this person needs help, and they're put into the jail setting. Well, what's going to happen? You know, so I feel that that this has really spurred me to look further into the stories that I've covered, and where did they go into the system, you know. So that's.
And Long Island is not nearly as homogeneous as you suggest.
I've got Salvador Rodriguez on deck. Salvador, over to you.
Hey, everyone. So this has been an enlightening couple of days with all these panels.
Salvador, can you identify yourself? What outlet you come from?
Yeah, so I'm Sal Rodriguez. I'm the editorial page editor for the Southern California News Group, a group of 11 newspapers across Southern California, including the Orange County Register and the Los Angeles Daily News. And back in the day, this was starting 11 years ago, I worked with Gene Casella and the late, great James Ridgway at Solitary Watch. Now from back then to today, I mean, there was even less known about solitary confinement back then.
Yes.
It's pretty staggering. But as we've all heard and learned today, the issue is, it remains as complicated as ever. You know, from a coverage perspective, there's still a lot of just basic facts that still need to be fleshed out, still need to be ascertained. Departments of Corrections will always play word games. They'll have different definitions, different standards, and then there is, like, objectively, you know, it is fuzzy. When does restrictive, incarceration becomes solitary confinement? When does it not become solitary confinement? I mean, this all started off yesterday with Dean Williams from Colorado, and there was it was made as if Colorado has done something significant in reducing solitary confinement, which sure they did, but as he said, it was nothing really special. They just they let people out and chained to a table and talk to their neighbors. It's like, I mean, I'm sure that's not what a lot of people, especially advocates and activists, have in mind when it comes to abolishing solitary confinement. They imagine that there's got to be something better than that as the standard as the great alternative. But that's still, arguably that's a step, that's an improvement over, the more barbaric, things that go on at ADX, for example, or the things that were going on in Pelican Bay, or things that are still going on in prison systems that most of us have not covered probably, or even thought to ask.
Tell us the news out of California today. This was the day that the legislature was going to vote on solitary, correct?
So the Mandela Act was already approved by the state legislature. So now it's before the governor, who has until tomorrow to sign all the pieces of legislation before him. It's his legislative deadline. So he has either today or tomorrow to sign it.
Oh, right. Tomorrow's the deadline. Sure.
Yeah. But I mean, that's a significant, piece of legislation. A decade ago, that was unheard of, that the governor of California would be considering something as sweeping as the Mandela Act for whatever shortfalls it may have and limitations. But compared to 10 years ago when, there was Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown, who, their idea was to have the private prisons and kick people off to other states. That was their great solution. And fight federal oversight of the prison system. So there's been considerable progress. I don't think any of us can deny that. But there's still a lot of work to do, obviously. And the work that has been done, we need to flesh out, obviously, the basics of what's going on, what's working, what's not working. To Chandra's point about what happens if that turns you into an apologist for solitary confinement. I mean, maybe someone will say that you're an apologist if you describe what's going on, what's complexities are, maybe. But as journalists, it's our job to map out what's the state of things and what's actually working, what's not working, what complexities are there, what imperfections are there, and to try to chart out realistic, where things can be.
Very well put.
Just wanna add-
Jeremiah, hold on. Jeremiah's hand was up, so let me.
sorry.
Then I'll go
Yeah,
to.
that I've got to endorse Chandra's point about being labeled an apologist. In the work I've been doing since I got out of prison, when it comes to criminal justice reform, there are the camp that is completely abolitionist. Mass incarceration is a form of modern day slavery, and the suggestion that you should reform it as opposed to end it is really offensive. And there's really no gray in that area that I found. And I happen to be somebody who wants to make the conditions, improve them to the extent they can be improved, because I've been under those conditions. And I want it to end, but until then, I want people to have better conditions. And I mean, I'm so serious about that. I can add to my bio, I'm working in the general counsel's office of Core Civic, the largest private prison company on earth. And the only reason I am getting away with this is because I spent so many years in solitary and had a life without parole sentence. If it wasn't for that force field, I would be getting castigated left and right. And so I have to feel her point about how you can get labeled when talking about these issues if it is anything except the end. We want to end slavery, not just not with them as much.
Thank you,
But
Jeremiah.
whether or not we're an apologist is really not the journalist's concern. And again, I have a bent, I have my own, but that's not the journalist's concern. And I personally, I'm an old head, I'm an old chick. I think that we hinder the very thing that we're trying to help be addressed when we get concerned, when we take sides, and unless we're an editorial writer. And even as an editorial writer, the good one paints every side of the story. But I don't think journalists should be concerned about whether or not we're an apologist for something, like that. That's not our job. As Jen just said, tell the fucking truth, whatever it is, tell it fully. And because I think we get sidetracked by these other things.
So Chandra, I'm going to give you a comment and then give all the other speakers a final round of comments, and then I think we'll have to close the conversation. It's great. We've gone to 6 o'clock. I'd go more, but I have a feeling I don't want to strain the patience of everybody else. But Chandra, over to you.
Yeah, I think that Caddy's point is right. That being concerned about how people are going to label you shouldn't be a concern, because I've done that. I've said things that people didn't like. I think that problem, Caddy, though, is that when you get labeled, a lot of times you lose sources. So I know a number of people who won't talk to me because they didn't like a position that I took or something that I reported, because this is a very highly politicized, group of people who are doing this work, whether they're going to be a source or, if an advocate is going to talk to you and let you know what's going on. So I think there is a cost on that. I agree, but worrying about what people think shouldn't be a concern, but that you're also losing sources and alienating them.
Okay, so let me do a final whip around of our speakers who want to, make some final comments, suggestions, ideas about where to go next in covering. But we've had a really, we could go on. I know that, but we will have to stop it off. So, Vinny, let me go to you, and then Gene, and then give Jeremiah the last word formally.
Yeah, two quick thoughts. One is, we kind of zip past the notion of stories about people who come out of prison, who have been in solitary. And, I worked on a death penalty case in New Jersey about a guy who, spent like 12 years in solitary and was released straight to the street from solitary. That's not extraordinarily uncommon. And he killed a cop within a week. And, the story about that is bad guy kills cop, not
Right.
Prison system drives somebody crazy, kills cop. And I think that, it's actually not that typical that people come out and commit homicides. And it'd be interesting to look at like how many of them have been in solitary, especially recently, before they came out. Because if you're looking at going back in on even a technical violation, he was caught on a non-violent crime and he killed a cop. But if you're looking going back in, and what you're going back into is torture and hell, you might do something a little crazier.
Yeah, it's too easy to cover stories like that. That's the problem.
What the other thought I just want to throw out, we focused on solitary as is proper because that's what the subject of this whole thing is. I think, people need to start to look at whether we're creeping towards where we were in the 90s on coverage of crime and its contribution to retrograde policies and elected officials. Solitary is probably a small bit of that. A bigger bit of that is what's happening with pushes to get tough to embarrass the other candidate.
I have to say, I totally agree with that. And that's really the elephant in the room, because we've been trying to hit that from really the beginning, that covering these issues of justice reform is a feel-good issue when things are good. But right now, they're not so good. And it's now an uphill battle. And I think understanding that is key to understanding how coverage is going to go in the next year.
That's right. And I've been in it long enough, 42 years, so I saw the other stuff, but some people haven't. For some people, crime's always gone down during their journalistic careers. This is what it looks like when it goes back up.
Exactly.
Politicians and journalists have to make a decision as to whether they want to rush to the flashing lights and the yellow tape to hear the mayor say, we've never had this kind of breed of super predator before, because that's where they're starting to go.
Gene?
Well, I think that's a really sobering thing to keep in mind, and focusing with a laser focus on solitary sometimes can distract from what that bigger picture looks like and the role journalism is playing there. But I want to just take one more stab at responding to what Chandra and Caddy have talked about. I've been invited to go to several prison systems, a couple of jails, including Cook County Jail in Chicago and the Colorado State Prisons, all to ostensibly show off the great work that they've done. And the stories that we produced afterwards made everybody mad. The corrections leaders were not happy. The advocates were not happy. They all thought we'd been too easy on the other ones. And I thought that was exactly where we wanted to be. So
Yes. Good point. Jeremiah, you get the last word.
I think a lot more work needs to be done. I think we need to reconceptualize what success is. I mean, when you're talking about the different recidivism rates of somebody who was confined in solitary for lengthy periods versus someone who wasn't, I think the deeper question is, what is the person's quality of life? If we're talking quality of life, I'm not a success story. I don't feel joy, happiness, and it looks like I'm taking over the world from the outside. I had a life without parole sentence, and now I'm about to be a lawyer. I don't feel anything. And that is a serious matter when you consider that it might be a consequence of all those years I spent in solitary.
So let me just follow up very quickly on that. So it's very hard not to acknowledge you as a success story, considering where you've come from. So, but writing about you, or you writing about yourself, makes it very complicated. I mean, what niche do you put yourself in? If that's not a success, what is? How do you measure it? That's not a question you can answer easily.
I think one important point is there's very little difference between me and anybody else who got out on parole. I have had parole violations. I've been caught up in drugs. All the same things that people get out and deal with, I have dealt with. And the only reason I happen to still be here is I had an enlightened parole board that understood what I was going through. But the root of all of it is that sense of apathy and just feeling nothing. When you can't feel anything, drugs feel really good, if that's the only thing that makes you feel something. And that can take you in a whole lot of different directions, one of which is recidivism, but it can also mean you have a miserable life and you stay free.
That's not a great note to end on, but Sandra just made a great point in her comment, saying people are looking for accomplishments to define success rather than contentment, which I think is a very, very smart point. But anyway, we could go on, but I want to really thank all of you, our speakers, for a really great finale to what's been a really absorbing conference. I hope all of you have gotten as much out of it as I have, and that we will, as a result, produce fantastic stories and understanding evidence-based stories about correction system, about solitary in particular, at a time when doing that is, as we've all acknowledged, an uphill battle. So thank you again. I'll be in touch with all of you in the follow-up. We have some answers to the questions you posed. And as I said earlier, there are lots of other things going on with the Center on Media, Crime and Justice and the Crime Report, which I'll keep you involved in and aware of. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us and for participating. It's been a great session. I hope all of you feel the same way. Thank you again. Have a great evening and be well.